Imagine a world where the monsters on your screen walk among us. What if the chilling actions of your favorite film antagonists weren't born from a writer's imagination, but mirrored by real people with dark, violent intentions? Tonight, we step into the shadows, where fiction meets reality, to reveal the true villains who breathed life into cinema's most terrifying creations. And trust me, sometimes reality is far scarier than the movies. Segment 1. Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. Our story begins in the quiet, rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. On the surface, Ed Gein looked like any other farmer, soft-spoken, unassuming, even helpful to his neighbors. But behind the peeling walls of his isolated farmhouse, something unspeakable was happening. Gein lived alone after the death of his domineering mother, Augusta, a woman whose strict, puritanical teachings shaped his warped view of women and morality. Obsessed with her memory, Gein developed a fascination with death, anatomy, and what he believed was the power to bring his mother back. At night, by the dim glow of a lantern, Gein slipped into graveyards. He dug up freshly buried corpses, exhuming women who reminded him of Augusta. From their remains he crafted grotesque objects, bowls made from human skulls, belts stitched from nipples, masks fashioned from faces. When police finally raided his home in 1957, they discovered what one sheriff described as a human slaughterhouse. Among the evidence was a suit made entirely from human skin, a suit Gein claimed he wore to transform himself into a woman so he could become his mother. It was grotesque, unthinkable, and unforgettable. Gein's legacy of horror didn't stay confined to Wisconsin. It seeped into Hollywood, where his depravity was reimagined in some of the most infamous villains of all time. Psycho gave us Norman Bates, the timid motel owner under the twisted influence of his dead mother's voice. Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre unleashed Leatherface, a hulking figure who carved flesh masks to hide behind. And in The Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill's chilling obsession with making a woman's suit from skin bore Gein's fingerprints on every seam. 3 villains, 3 nightmares, each one terrifying in its own way, but all rooted in one man's madness. Segment 2. Charles Starkweather, teenage killer on the run. In the late 1950s, America idolized the rebel. James Dean smoldered on the big screen. Leather jackets and hot rods became symbols of freedom. The open road promised escape, but for one teenager, that image of rebellion curdled into something far darker. Charles Starkweather was just 19, a boy with a permanent scowl, jet black hair, and a defiance etched into every movement. To those who saw him on the streets of Lincoln, Nebraska, he was a misfit. To himself, he was an outlaw in the making. At his side was Carol Ann Fugate. Only 14 years old, she was caught in Starkweather's orbit. Whether as an accomplice, a hostage, or both, history still debates. Together, they set out on a journey that turned into a trail of blood. It began in January of 1958. Starkweather entered Carol's home where her mother, stepfather, and little sister lived. Hours later, all 3 were dead, murdered in cold blood. The spree had begun. As they fled across Nebraska and Wyoming, the killings piled up. A gas station attendant shot in the back. A wealthy couple slain in their mansion, their maid butchered as well. An entire farmhouse soaked in blood, where the silence of the plains was broken only by the echo of screams. 11 lives, stolen without remorse. The public reeled in horror. Neighbors described walking into crime scenes where bodies lay crumpled on kitchen floors, televisions still humming in the background, dinners left half-eaten on the table. Innocence collided with brutality, and nowhere seemed safe. For the first time, America was forced to confront the face of youthful violence. Newsreels branded them the modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, but the comparison was a cruel illusion. There was no glamour here, no romance, only aimless destruction, arrogance, and bloodlust wearing the mask of teenage rebellion. Years later, Hollywood would resurrect their story. Oliver Stone's natural-born killers reimagined them as Mickey and Mallory Knox, a pair of lovers whose passion burned as hot as their hatred for the world. But beneath the stylized violence and media frenzy was the same unsettling truth. What happens when innocence is corrupted by rage and rebellion turns into murder? Segment 3. Jack Unterweger, the literary killer. In Vienna, Austria, the lights dim, and a man in a crisp suit steps onto the stage. A spotlight finds him. The audience leans forward as he begins to read his poetry, his voice smooth, his words mesmerizing. That man was Jack Unterweger, once a convicted murderer, now paraded before the world as the very symbol of redemption. After serving time for killing a young woman in the 1970s, Unterweger was released amid a wave of public sympathy. He had written plays, essays, and an autobiography behind bars, works hailed as proof of his transformation. Politicians, celebrities, and intellectuals embraced him as a success story, the murderer who had turned his life around. He mingled at dinner parties with Vienna's elite. He gave interviews in expensive suits, flashing a charming smile, speaking eloquently about crime, punishment, and the human spirit. He even became a journalist himself, writing articles about the sex trade and covering murders of sex workers with chilling detail. But beneath the polished exterior, Unterweger was no reformed man. He was hunting again. As he traveled through Austria, Czechoslovakia, and even across the ocean to Los Angeles, women began to vanish. His victims, almost all sex workers, were found in forests, alleys, and riverbeds, each one strangled with her own bra, her body discarded like trash. The signature was always the same. Investigators began to notice the pattern. The same ritual, the same cruelty, the same mocking flourish of a predator who thought he'd never be caught. To the public, he was the literary star in a tailored suit. To his victims, he was a charming man who got close enough to kill. Unterweger lived a double life. By day, he signed autographs and read to enraptured audiences. By night, he strangled women, leaving their bodies to rot in the dark. Applause followed his words, while silence fell over shallow graves. He wasn't just a criminal. He was proof that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it hides behind charisma, intellect, and sophistication. And Hollywood paid attention. Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, the polished, charming professional with a taste for blood. Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, a cultured gentleman whose intellect masks unthinkable brutality. Even characters like Joe Carroll in The Following and Paul Spector in The Fall echo Unterweger's chilling blend of charm and predation. The charming sociopath didn't spring from imagination alone. It was pulled from reality, from a killer who convinced the world he was reformed while secretly writing his darkest chapters in blood. Segment 4. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Los Angeles, summer of 1985. The city glittered with neon lights and Hollywood dreams. But in the heat, in the dark, something else stirred. A shadow slipping across lawns, a window sliding open, footsteps on the carpet. Richard Ramirez, the man the press would call the Night Stalker. He was tall and skeletal, his face a gaunt mask, his eyes as cold as midnight. To his victims, he wasn't just a criminal. He was terror incarnate. He had no pattern, no profile, no logic that detectives could pin down. The young, the old, the wealthy, the working class. He hunted them all. He carried knives, guns, a tire iron. Sometimes he killed, sometimes he tortured. Sometimes he simply left a trail of fear. Survivors described waking to the stench of sweat, the sound of heavy breathing, and the gleam of steel inches from their faces. Ramirez whispered threats, invoked Satan, and carved his legend into the city one home invasion at a time. By dawn, Los Angeles felt smaller. The sun came up, but safety never returned. Families triple-locked their doors. Hardware stores sold out of padlocks and deadbolts. Strangers looked at one another with suspicion. The city of angels was paralyzed by fear of the devil at their doorstep. What made Ramirez so terrifying wasn't just the brutality, it was the randomness. He wasn't hunting for money, he wasn't hunting for revenge. He was hunting for chaos, for pleasure, for the sick thrill of watching the world burn. And the image of him, disheveled black hair, sharp cheekbones, clothes as dark as his intent, became almost cinematic. He looked like he had stepped off the screen, a real-life boogeyman haunting the boulevards. Hollywood took notice. You see echoes of Ramirez in villains like Freddy Krueger, the night invader who slips through your defenses and strikes where you should be safest. In the masked killers of urban slashers who kill without warning or reason. Even Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men carries that Ramirez-like aura, unstoppable, unpredictable, and void of remorse. Richard Ramirez wasn't just a killer. He was the living embodiment of a slasher villain, chaos in human form. And for Los Angeles in 1985, the horror wasn't on the movie screen. It was in their own bedrooms. Segment 5. Aileen Wuornos, the monster within. Along the lonely highways of Florida, truckers and businessmen drove past the scrub pines and neon-lit motels. And there, standing on the shoulder, thumb out, was a woman who carried a storm inside her. Aileen Wuornos. For 7 men, she would be the last face they ever saw. Wuornos broke every mold of what a serial killer was supposed to be. She wasn't a shadow lurking in alleyways or a stranger creeping through windows. Instead, she was visible, approachable, meeting her victims in plain sight, sharing a cigarette, a drink, or a short ride down the road. And then, in a flash, the gun was in her hand. Her claim was always the same: self-defense. She told police and later the courts that each man had tried to assault her, that her killings were acts of survival in a world that had used and discarded her since childhood. But investigators saw something else. Men shot, wallets taken, cars abandoned, bodies left in ditches and brush as if they were refuse. To many, Wuornos was a monster in every sense. Ruthless, manipulative, unrepentant. Yet to others, she was a tragic byproduct of abuse, poverty, and desperation. Raised in violence, abandoned by family, forced into sex work at a young age, her life seemed like a long chain of betrayals that led her to the trigger. The public was divided. Was she a predator or a victim who finally fought back? Her story exploded into popular culture with Monster, a film that stripped away the tabloid headlines and forced audiences to confront her as a human being. Charlize Theron's Oscar-winning performance showed Wuornos not as a caricature of evil, but as a deeply wounded soul, torn between her rage and her longing for love. And that is where her place in villainy becomes so haunting. Because unlike Ramirez, Bundy, or Starkweather, Wuornos didn't embody pure chaos or arrogance. She embodied something more uncomfortable. The idea that monsters can be shaped, molded, and made by the cruelty of others. Her life asks a question that lingers long after the final frame. Was Aileen Wuornos a cold-blooded killer hiding behind excuses? Or was she a tragic reflection of a world that creates the very demons it fears?
Segment 6. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown.
And then there was the clown. In 1970s Chicago, John Wayne Gacy seemed like the kind of man you could trust. He was a local businessman, active in politics, known to neighbors as the guy who hosted summer cookouts and holiday parties. And most memorably, he dressed up as Pogo the Clown, performing at parades and charity events, bringing laughter to children with his painted grin. But behind the grease paint was something unspeakable. Gacy lured young men and boys into his home with promises of work, money, or simply a place to hang out. His victims never walked back out. Inside his house, the mask of Pogo slipped away, revealing a predator who bound, tortured, and murdered with cold precision. When investigators finally searched his suburban home, they made a discovery so horrifying it would haunt them for life. Beneath the floorboards of the crawlspace, they unearthed body after body, 29 in all, crammed into shallow graves that turned the very foundation of his home into a mass grave. Some victims were so tightly packed together that their remains fused, leaving a tangle of bones that testified to years of hidden atrocities. Detectives described the suffocating stench of decay, the unbearable heat as they crawled beneath the house, and the chilling silence that hung over the crime scene. Each body exhumed was another stolen future, another family destroyed, another reminder of how evil can wear the mask of normalcy. But perhaps Gacy's most lasting legacy isn't just in true crime, it's in horror itself. His double life, beloved clown above ground, sadistic killer beneath, shattered the innocence of the clown archetype forever. No longer symbols of joy and fun, clowns became vessels of dread. Stephen King's Pennywise, Rob Zombie's Captain Spaulding. Countless horror jesters owe their terror to Gacy's shadow. The painted smile was never the same again, because after John Wayne Gacy, every clown carries the same unspoken question. What if the laughter is only a mask, and the real joke is deadly? Outro. When monsters walk among us. They say art imitates life, but sometimes it's life that's more terrifying than any film. Charles Starkweather and his teenage rampage inspired the young outlaw lovers who burn across cinema screens. Jack Unterweger, the polished predator, cemented the archetype of the charming sociopath, the killer who hides behind culture and charisma. Richard Ramirez became the living embodiment of the slasher villain, striking at random, a phantom in the night. Aileen Wuornos blurred the line between victim and villain, forcing us to confront whether monsters are born or made. And John Wayne Gacy, he turned the clown from harmless entertainer into a nightmare that still lurks in our cultural imagination. Each of these figures walked among us. They smiled, they charmed, they deceived. And in their wake, filmmakers found the blueprints for horror's greatest villains. But unlike the movies, these stories had no script, no escape, no credits to roll when the terror ended. The truth is simple, yet haunting. The monsters we fear on screen are nothing compared to the monsters that walk beside us.